Hey everyone. How are you guys doing? Welcome, welcome. So we have another workshop for the new data set for the new month's challenge. So yeah, as always, what the webinar is really all about, right? So what we do in these workshops is we basically go through the data set itself. We talk about what could be some of the good practices, some tips, tricks, and so forth, basically to kind of give you a little bit of a guidance on how to proceed with this. Now, the most important thing, as always, that I just want to reiterate every single time is don't be afraid to try, right? You don't have to create the very first ideal report which uses every single functionality that Power BI has to offer. You don't have to do that. Just advance with every single report, with every single challenge participation. Try to do something new because weirdly enough, uh, when it came to last month's challenges, I had a couple of one-on-one sort of consultations with participants who were very eager to participate for the very first time, but they were too afraid to submit their work because they were feeling, okay, I'm not utilizing field parameters to the maximum, I'm not utilizing dynamic titles or something. So I just want to reiterate once again, guys, you don't have to utilize every single possible feature that's out there. You don't have to use every single thing that, for example, the winning report has done. You create a report that you can at that point. You submit the report, you get the feedback, and you just get better and better and better. That's the main idea about the challenges. That's what we're trying to do with this sort of ecosystem, with the challenges, with the monthly challenges, actually. So, yeah, don't be afraid to try. If you don't try, you're not going to be able to sort of advance your skills. Well, you can, but it's just a lot slower than by getting feedback, talking about it, looking what could be done better, how to utilize this, putting your questions out there, and everything like that. But yeah, hey everyone, thanks again for joining. So, you have also a QR code now, so we just changed the design a bit. I think it looks a bit nicer than the previous one. Yeah, there we go. We even got the glow going, right, guys? So yeah, if you don't know, we're talking about the Onyx Data Challenge. So this month we're going to be talking about customer analysis and risk assessment for a bank data set. So basically a transactional data set that has information regarding credit cards, information regarding users. It's very sort of interesting approach. It's something that we haven't done really previously. Usually we try to keep this very simple with just giving you a flat table. This time we're giving you sort of multiple dimensions and giving you the opportunity to see how you want to proceed with this. Um, Alexander, can you go to the agenda slide? Seems. Thank you. Yeah, so for those of you who are here for the first time, for those who have been here, you already know the drill, right? It's the same principle every single time. For those of you who are new, like I said, we're going to be talking about the data set itself. We're going to be looking at the data a little bit, explaining some of the columns, giving you a few tips and tricks very quickly, and so forth. Then we're going to talk about the data visualizations that could potentially be used in this particular data set. And then, of course, about the challenge itself. And one thing that I also want to mention is there is actually a post on our LinkedIn where Alexandra already posted. So this is a post that just tells you, for example, a couple of visuals that might be useful for you when it comes to this particular challenge. It doesn't mean that you necessarily must use them, right? Remember, it's up to you to decide how you want to showcase this and what you want to visualize and how you want to visualize. These are just some ideas. It's the same as you have a full gallery of previous challenges where you could look at some of the work that previously has been done, some of the features and everything. There's a lot of different materials, but ultimately you decide how you want to proceed with this. So it's completely up to you. Now, for those of you who are new here as well, one last thing that I want to mention is, let me just quickly share the screen. There we go. Gonna hide this pop-up message. So, doo, 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 doo. There we go. So for those of you who are new here, right? Those of you who have been here, you already know the drill. You can get the developer's license, and most of you already had it. What the developer's license gives is the opportunity to use every single one of our visuals without any limitations. Well, within the constraints of the challenge, of course, you can't use it commercially afterwards. There are some limitations on that. But when it comes to the challenge, this is where you can get a license. This is your account. You're going to get a password. And on the first time when you get the password, remember that you're going to be asked to change it. So this password afterwards is not going to work anymore, right? This is just the primary password for the first login. So just remember to write down your password somewhere. Once you get the developer's account, you can log into Power BI, and then you're going to have the ability to utilize all of our visuals without any limitations. So you're going to be able to try all of them out. That's one thing. This is also where you submit your report. And most importantly, this is also where you can get the data set, right? Get the data, look at the brief, for example, also a couple ideas on what you can do here. When it comes to the data set, what you're going to get at the end is going to be the following. I'm going to move this to this screen right here. Gonna wait a second for the QR code. There we go. So in the data set itself, what you're gonna have is 4 different Excel files. You're gonna have information regarding the cards. You're gonna have information regarding the merchant categories, transactions, and users. So basically customers. Then you have example data model. You can use this. You can also go with different approaches. It really depends on what you're going to be utilizing at the very end. You don't necessarily have to use every single bit of information that's available. Remember this, guys. You don't have to create every possible KPI that's out there. You need to create a story. That story needs to be told with the visuals and with the KPIs and cards that you have created within that report. If you try to answer everything, inevitably it just becomes sort of like a little bit of a hot mess, right? You have a bit of this, bit of that, but nothing gets answered fully. So make sure you kind of figure out what direction you want to take with this, and then see what data you need to support this, and only utilize that data. Remember, the data that you don't need to use doesn't need to be also loaded into Power BI. Why? Because there's no reason to just have data because unless it's giving you additional information or something that you're going to be utilizing afterwards, don't load it or delete it, right? That's the main principle there. What else? You also have this visual cheat sheet. And in the cheat sheet, basically what we're doing is we're trying to explain to you what visuals can be replaced with one of our visuals, just to kind of give you an idea of what can be done with the visuals, right? Like for example, columns, lines, areas, stack columns, clustered columns, all those combinations can easily be replaced with a single combo visual. If it's time-based, well, it's going to be the timeline visual. If you're talking about donuts or pies, well, quite simple, right? Different maps, the new graph network. Also in the cheat sheet, we don't have the new visual, which is something I'm gonna just tell you straight away. Don't forget that we also have a scatter plot visual. Scatter plot visual was, I'd say, relatively recently announced. So that's a visual that you also have available right now, which also has a bunch of different interesting and useful features for this dataset specifically. So that's definitely something you can utilize there. All right, enough about that. Let's go and take a look at the data set. So already played around a little bit with the data, but if we go into Power Query, you can see what I did is I always load in the dictionaries as well. I've been telling you this every single time whenever I have a workshop. I always load the dictionaries. You don't necessarily have to pass them to Power BI. You can keep them into Power Query, but I usually have them here because I don't like to go back on the file manager, finding the location of the file, finding the Excel opening, going to the dictionary sheet. Just seems like a lot of work. Sorry. There we go. So I have my dictionaries and I have my data. I renamed some of them, so it just makes a little bit more sense to me. Like for example, MCC codes, I just call them merchant codes, so it's easier for me to find it afterwards. But essentially, you have your data, you have your dictionary, so you can understand what each column represents and what's the value within it, right? So you can better understand how things are connected and what it represents. Now, when it comes to data, there are a few things that I want you to pay attention to. And that is that whenever you load in the data set for the first time, like for example, I think transaction data is the one that let me just quickly check. Um, no, was it the user data? Yeah, user data. All right, let's do this from scratch, just to kind of showcase what I mean. Let's go for user data. I'm not gonna send it afterwards to Power BI again. I'm gonna delete the query, but for now, Onyx challenges, December, and user data. So let's load that in. And I'm going to be using user data. Okay. user data 2. I'm going to rename it, delete afterwards so I know. So remember, whenever you're adding Excel as a primary source of information, one thing that comes with those Excels and also from the data models that you have set up through the file options of Power BI is the data model language. So in this case, for example, if you look at the data, you can see that, for example, latitude and longitude has been recognized as text, right? Which isn't necessarily the case. Latitude and longitude is a number. It's a decimal number that needs to be recognized properly. But since I live in Latvia, for example, our regional settings determine that the comma delimiter, or basically the decimal separator, is a comma, not a dot. So if I would just try to convert this into a decimal number, I would get an error. There are two ways on how you can do this in order to convert the values properly. One way is what I did in the very beginning because I didn't know all the other options, is I just basically converted this to a text, made sure that it's a text, go to replace values, and then say that, hey, I want to replace a dot with a comma. There we go. And then converted it into a decimal number. So you can see we have a couple of errors. And in these errors, we can see that it seems like it's a data quality issue because I'm pretty sure that looks like a date, right? But this is what's going to happen in real world scenarios as well. Not always you're going to get clean data. You have to figure out what to do with this. In our case, since it's just a challenge data set, what I'm probably going to be doing this, and this is what I did on the other data set as well, is I just removed the errors. There's no need for me to keep them. Alternatively, I can qualify them as something else. For example, give them a location of 00, so I can use it afterwards. But for now, I would just remove them. But this is one way, right? So basically convert the column into text, replace the values, and then convert into a decimal number. Alternatively, what you can do is if you right click on a column, you have this option of going change type, and the very last option is using locale. Now, using locale means that you're applying a different locality for the import of the data for that particular column. For example, if I use this, I'm going to open it up. I have to define which data type, not time, I'm going to be referencing. So I'm going to say that, hey, this is going to be a decimal number. And this is the most important part because this is something that people always confuse. You need to define the locale, not to the one you're converting to, but from which you're taking the value. So see, below here, sample input values. So this is where you define the input locale. So in my case, I want to input to be from English, United States. United States, there we go. Decimal number, English, United States. We can see that the thousand separator and comma decimal separator is also a dot now. So I can click OK, and that's going to convert the values. It's the same principle, just taking away those two additional steps. They're both going to give you exactly the same result. It's just different approaches on how you handle things. So this is one of the things that I want you to take a look at the dataset, right? If you load in the dataset straight away and it seems like some of the columns don't work, try to figure out what to do with them. Can you convert these values? Do you need to change something? Is it the locality of the value? Is it the format of the value? Like, what is the reason why this is being triggered? Another thing, if we go down the road, you can see, for example, per capita income, yearly income, total debt, and so forth. One of the things that's happening here is you have a dollar sign in every single one of these values. So of course, what Power BI does is it cannot recognize this as a number because there is a dollar. Dollar is not a number. So what I could do is a very basic approach, replace values, and just replace a dollar sign with nothing. Once you do that, I can convert this into a number. You can also clean the data in Excel file if it's more convenient to you. You don't have to do it in the Power Query. There are multiple ways in how this can be handled. Um, Purely from a challenge perspective and from learning perspective, I would say train in Power Query because some transformations need to be done in Power Query to make things more automatic in the future. So it's better that you learn these things on how to do it in Power Query, going forward. But if you just feel more comfortable by adjusting things in Excel files, I'm not gonna take away points for that or scold you for that. It's completely up to you as long as you get to the result. So also take a note of that. Make sure that none of the columns utilize this type, ABC123. ABC123 means that Power BI wasn't able to determine the data type correctly, so it gave it a general data type, meaning that it might be a number, it might be a text, it might be something in between. There might be values which are considered text, there might be values which it considers numbers, right? So ABC1 through 3, essentially what it defines or creates is whenever you're going to be starting to create DAX measures, it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to write a proper syntax where basically the proper variables. Because when you're going to be saying that, for example, this particular value has to be higher than 100, but the column considers that value to be a text, it's not going to be able to convert it and compare them. And it's going to give you an error that you cannot compare values of type value versus value of type text. So just these things are going to eventually come up. So it's better to spend a little bit more time in the Power Query cleaning the data and prepping it, and then going to the visual part of things. Then go to the visuals and then realizing that you can't really use almost any of the columns because either this, or that. Make sure you clean the data. And as much as I would love to say that data visualization is all about creating amazing visuals, 80% of the time is data cleaning and preparation. Because without proper data, you cannot create proper visuals. Without proper visuals, you cannot create a good data story. It just falls in line, right? So just something to take into account. Credit scores as well, we can go through them, but I would probably say just make sure you convert this into a whole number, and you can see right here, everything's good. Going forward, this is something already, number of credit cards issued and so forth. So there's just different types of information, but just make sure you apply the correct data types to all the data in all the tables, which you are using, of course. What else? If there's any columns that you want to create additionally, remember, there is no rule that defines that you cannot create anything on top of this. No, this is just the base data set. If you have ideas on how to enhance it, go for it. You're more than welcome to do it. It's always interesting to see what people decide to do or sort of what approaches they decide to take. Here's an example. Under, let's say, cards data, right? So what we have is, for example, we have the expires data. And we can see that we have basically dates going from as early as 1999, so a very old card or a client of ours. If we go down, we have December of 2024. There might be more because the list is incomplete. So theoretically, since I have this expiration date, I could also, for example, create a conditional column, which is basically a flag whether the card is expired or not. Based on that, I could create some sort of a measure that, for example, changes the color of the customer's profile if he has expired cards on his profile or something like that. So there are things that you can play around. If you think that not enough customers have cards for which the expiration date is, in the future, so they have active cards and you want to increase it or decrease it, you can also play around with these values. There's no strict way on how you need to handle this. You can adjust the data sets, you can modify the data sets, as long as it allows you to create a beautiful data story. That's the main thing, right? You're able to create visuals, you're able to create KPIs, an interesting data story, an interesting solution that you just have sort of a proud moment presenting. Let's put it like that, right? So if you have any ideas, just go for it. Some of you might be able to do more complex things, some of you might not. I'm probably in the category of I'm not the most complex solution guy. I usually go with very basic approaches. And when it comes to complex solutions, thank God I have my teammates who can do it for me. For merchants, it's a very basic data set. It basically gives you the merchant category identifier, which can be then afterwards connected to the transactions, and that gives you what sort of merchant category it falls into, right? Whether the department stores, money transfers, fast food restaurants, and so forth. So you don't have to go through individual business names, for example. Transactional data, the dates, client ID, cards ID. Yeah, just make sure that all these are correct because I remember when I loaded in card IDs and client IDs, for example, were treated as text, which is something that I really don't want to do. I want them to be numbers, just not summarized. Rest of them, what else? No, rest of them seems good. One thing to pay attention to, for example, you have this right here, merchant state, right? On the first glance, it seems like, yeah, these seem like states in US, for example, right? California, Texas, New York, Florida, and so forth. But if you open up the full list, you can see that there's also, for example, country names like Ireland, Italy, Mexico, and so forth. So just don't sort of treat the column name as an identifier for what's going to be always in the column. Do some little bit of investigation. Just look at the data set, try to understand what's in it. If you're not going to be using this, of course, just disregard it. You can delete it afterwards if you're not using it. But if you're going to be using it, make sure you check the values prior to starting to create the visuals, just to understand how to handle this. Because, for example, if you would create a map with just the US states, and then suddenly you have Ireland or Mexico, well, it doesn't really fit, right? Because it's a completely different country. So just things like that. Other than that, I'm gonna delete this one because I don't need it. There we go, delete. Oh yeah, one other thing that you can do is for the queries that you create for different data sets, like for example for dictionaries, I don't want them to show up right here in the full table list. And there are sort of two ways on how this could be handled. I could just load them in directly, and then afterwards right here through the table view, I could say that, for example, just as an example, right? I could say that user data, for example, is not visible. I can see it in the table view, but if I go to the report view, you can see it's not here. So this is one way on how you could theoretically hide the dictionaries. What I did this time is I kept them only in Power Query. So in Power Query, you have this option of right-clicking on a query and disabling the load. Disabling load, what it essentially means is it allows Power BI to connect to the dataset and keep it in the query without passing the values to Power BI desktop. So basically to that data view. So there's a little bit of a performance impact as well whenever you pass new datasets. So it doesn't have to go through these lines as well. But I wanted to be able to reach this basically to look at the definitions of the fields and see what's exactly in them. Uh, yeah, okay, that goes for that for Power Query. Let's go for the report view. So for the report itself, I'd say this time you have a bunch of different ways and how you can handle this, especially since you have basically by default already four different massive dimensions like cards separately, merchants, transactions, and users. Each of one of them could be handled separately as, for example, a separate analysis. You can start to combine them in different ways. So there's different ways on how you can approach this. On the challenge page itself, what we told you, two of the options that you can look into if you don't have any other ideas is, let's open up the challenges, Onyx data, the brief. The two ideas that we give you is customer profiling and segmentation. And you can see focus areas, there also can be multiple of them. So this is sort of a major group, and then afterwards you have minor groups. And also transactions and risk analysis. There's already a couple of ideas. Few other ideas that come to mind whenever I saw this, for example, is I could create something that allows the analyst to basically look into a single user view. So what I did here is basically I created a separate block which allows me to identify the customer itself. Of course, since it's sensitive data, let's assume that's an actual data set, so I don't have a name and last name, so I'm going for by customer ID. I know in Latvia, for example, as well, when we contact the banks, they don't ask for your name and surname, they ask for your identifier. So this is one way how we could do it. So I don't know, let's say our customer ID 64 is a female, 39, number of credit cards available are 2, credit score, total debt 0, amazing, yearly income, multiple card types, MasterCard is the master brand, all of her cards have chips, the customer since 2013, credit line 30K, total cards issued 3. Like an overview of a customer. And then, for example, since I have those multiple cards available, like 2 cards available, I can look and investigate each individual card as well. Created that as a separate table. Sum of amount, credit limit as well. Play around with what exactly you want to have within here. You can also go ahead and, for example, create like little pop-up boxes that allow you to see a more detailed version of this, whereas here just have an overview, but have a different view which allows you to go into details. Or alternatively, of course, don't forget that you have the capability of using drill-through pages as well. So that's also one of the options. So this is a customer profile. Based on that customer profile, I wanted to follow two different metrics. I wanted to look at the transactional amounts, so to see if there's any sort of pattern that I'm starting to see for the customer, is there's any seasonality, any particular time periods, like beginning of the month, end of the month. So here I'm looking just on a monthly view for all the transactions that this particular customer has made. And I'm looking at a purple line, which is the sum of amount. So the total amount of spent every single point that has there. And the other one is the average amount, just to kind of see if there's a pattern that follows the line or the average expenditure doesn't really change, right? I can switch between the granularity. So for example, if I want to investigate like the last 3 months, for example, in more detail, I could just select it and just drill down into those 3 months and look at the daily level. We can see we have some ups and downs, and we have some days where there has been no transactions whatsoever. So by default, what's going to happen in a timeline is you're going to have this setting disabled. So when you're going to hover over it, this is how it's going to look like, right? So for example, sum of amount and average of amount, you can see a dollar sign and a particular value. If I move one day to the right, you can see it's the same series, but the values are just dashes, right? Because there's, well, no physical value to provide here. So this is sort of a default behavior that we have here. Alternatively, under tooltip settings, you can also enable a feature called hide rows with no data. And what that allows you to do is also to provide a custom message. So now, instead of just providing, for example, those dashes, whenever a user hovers over a time period where there's no transactions, I just physically say, well, there's no transactions, right? So always play around with different properties, see what else is possible, see what sort of detail level can you provide to the user. Because if I would have it on a default value as well, what it would say is no data, right? I felt that no data doesn't really tell sort of like the full picture or full story. So I said, you know what? No transactions for this particular data set just makes more sense. So now, hover, no transactions. Easy as that. What else? On the donut chart right here, what I did is I'm using basically two different variables. I have whether it or not or sort of what type of transaction it is, whether it's a chip transaction or an online transaction. And underneath it, I'm going for the merchant codes. So basically based on those descriptions. So theoretically, I could also do this. Instead of MCC codes, I could replace this with merchant descriptions. Same principle, just utilizing different branches of information. So that's one thing. What else? On this view, one important thing that to mention is I'm also only focusing on sort of the debit, not the credit. Because remember, a credit card statement can have two sides, right? One's debit, one's credit. So money is coming in or money is going out. So based on that, also see which one is more reliable or understandable for the user in that particular view. Don't try to summarize things where they don't make sense, right? It's just as simple as that. So this is one of the ideas that you can essentially utilize. Alternatively, we can go for page 2, where what I did is I played a bit around with the map visual, with the scatter plot, and also with a timeline. And here I specifically added this switch between credit and debit. So for example, if I'm interested more in the credit side of things, I can just use this single select slicer to allow me to focus on the values that are in the negative. For the timeline, I would probably just adjust and make the toolbar outside so it's not on top of the values. So playing around with these definitely is going to help you. But yeah, it allows me to focus on whether one side of the statement or the other. I can, of course, zoom in, for example, for more detailed views. If I wanted to split this by something else, I can always go ahead and use another category and create donut charts on this. Like for example, I don't know, let's go for debit, right? And then as a category, what would I want to do? Transactions, whether or not they're using a chip. Yeah, that's fine. Was it? Transactions data. See, this is why you have the dictionary. Transactions data. Where is it? Use chip, Boolean indicating if the chip was used during the transaction. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna be using this for analysis. So find the category column, use chip. There we go. The value is gonna be based on the amount. So now I go into the node settings, scroll down, bar charts and nodes, and there we go. Trip transaction, online transaction, and swipe transaction, which allows me to do even further analysis. So I can say, for example, I don't know, I want to focus on the online transactions and from this particular cluster. So that passes out a filter. I'm only interested in transactions from 2024. There we go. I actually want to see it on a monthly level. We can see the 2 last months of 24 are not available. And I want to cross filter this information based on these nodes which are above $300. There we go. So cross-filtering the information is one of the benefits of kind of having the availability of it. So play around with these, have your KPIs on top of it, because currently you don't have any KPIs, so it might not sort of feel very intuitive. That's why you usually have some sort of cards. But don't forget that you can also apply conditional formatting to these, for example. You can also add thresholds. Like for example, let's see, on the y-axis you have number of transactions. Okay, so on the y-axis, I want to create an area threshold, which is starting from, let's say, 1000 and up until, I don't know, so I'm just going to hold 9 for a while, right? So this allows me to, for example, create that area going from one side to the other, or I could say, for example, I don't know, 2000, just as an idea. So create that, and this is going to allow me to, for example, highlight certain transactions to quickly visualize and analyze, okay, what a number of transactions fall into this segment. If I start to cross filter, well, that's going to just narrow it down. And we can see that, for example, in this view, the number 1000 transactions is just too high because it's physically still there, but it's quite far away. So play around with those thresholds as well, because you can create them constant as a constant value, or you can also use one of the aggregations, like for example, average. So everything that starts from average and goes up until 2000 is going to be in that red area. Same goes for the x-axis. So the x-axis, what it shows us is the sum of amount. So for transactions where the total number transferred is above, I don't know, let's say again 5,000. So I'm going to make an area again. Doesn't necessarily have to be red. You can adjust it. I don't know, this is going to be blue, for example. So starting from 5,000 up until 10,000. It went a bit too high, 10,000. There we go. You can combine them as well if you want. So see where the overlap is. So higher than 5,000 in total spent and more than average amount of transactions in count. So everything that falls in here, use a rectangular selection and cross filter it to everything else. So there's a lot of interesting capabilities that you can utilize here. For the charts itself, don't forget also that this is what we talked about a lot in the previous webinar, so you can take a look at one of those. But also don't forget the power of field parameters. So field parameters just allow you to switch between the values that you're showing on an axis, right? So what's the value that you're focusing on? So those allow you to have even sort of more theoretical visuals in the same place rather than just replacing them or creating X amount of pages. Just have the same information but for a different value. So that's another thing. What else? Third page. What I did here is again a different view. So here what I did is I wanted to create sort of an overview of what's really happening with all the transactions, all the customers, all the merchants and so forth. So what I did is I created a couple of cards at the top. And on the cards, I wanted to focus on clients, total amount, the number of transactions, the maximum amount being transferred in a single transaction, the median amount, and the minimum amount. And this is where things sort of become interesting as well, because you can see that maximum is, for example, plus 1.9K, whereas the minimum is minus 500. So this gives you an idea. Okay, what if I force the user to look only at the positives or negatives? That's why you have the debit and credit. The debit and the credit is actually a column that I created that's not in the original data set, but it's very simple to be made. In my case, I just did a conditional column, I think. Yeah. If transaction amount is equal or higher to 0, then it's a debit. If it's else, basically, then the credit, sorry. You can also do this in Power Query with conditional columns, whichever is easier for you, do that approach. So on the combo chart, I essentially use the merchant groups. In the merchant groups, I applied the top 10. For those of you who don't know how to apply the top 10, it's a very quick principle. We can actually do it like this, so I don't have to recreate the whole chart. I'm just going to take this as an original copy, paste it here, there we go, and I'm going to remove this filter. So if you add in, for example, merchant groups based on amount, in the filter panel, you're going to have these two options, descriptions or amount. You need to choose the category. So that is description in this case. Open it up, and by default, this is going to be sitting on either advanced or basic. If it's text, typically it's basic. If it's numbers, more usually you have it as an advanced filter. But the one you have to choose is top N, basically top number. Then you choose whether you want to focus on top or the bottom. In my case, I want to stick to the top. I want to see the top 10 merchant groups. And the most important thing here is remember to add a value. Unless you add a value, you're not going to be able to click on apply filter. If you add the value, you can apply the filter. A typical question is, why do I need to add a value since you already have the value right here, right? Well, I just added a series, so there is a physical value there. The answer is quite simple. Not always you want to select the top 10 by the same number that's being visualized in the series. Because I could, for example, purely theoretically, right? Let's say that I want to showcase on the visual the total amount that's being transferred with all the transactions in that particular merchant group. But what I want to filter it by is the total amount of fees that we received from these transactions. We don't have it in this data set, but just as an idea, right? So I want to see the top 10 most profitable and see how much they're being transferred in total. And then right next to them, I could, for example, keep an original top 10 and see if those categories are similar or if the top 10 most profitable ones are also the top 10 with the most transactions. Would be reasonable, but hey, you know, weirder things have happened. So you can easily play around with those as well. Now going back to this. On a timeline, I kept it simple. I added the date from the transaction. I added the sum of the amount. You could, of course, add also a legend. Again, we could use the same, for example, use the chip, and you can have it as a cluster. Or if you go into the formatting options and say series defaults and say that this is a stacked, you can also go ahead and do this. If these columns seem a little bit too massive for you, you can play around on the x-axis with this maximum unit width. So you could go for something like, I don't know, 50, for example, which doesn't seem to do anything on the initial load. That's because you need to refresh the visual. So if we switch between the pages, you can see it kind of forces it to be 50 pixels, but you now have a different problem. You're kind of forcing the user to look at an area which doesn't have any data. Now, it might seem a little bit weird at first, but remember, you force the visual to not allow the categories to be more than 50%. Since this is a timeline, sure, we could, for example, put it here or keep it in the middle, but it's not going to really change the principle that there's always going to be years between and after. It is an actual calendar, right? This is not a combo visual. With a combo visual, it's a bit easier because then you define the boundaries of things. With a timeline, well, it follows an actual timeline. So you can play around with these things as well. I don't want to have it anymore, so I'm just going to reset and reload the chart. There we go. We still have the capabilities of drilling down and looking into data a little bit further. Alternatively, something you can play around with is adjusting the initial display unit and period. Like for example, let's say I want to look at monthly data, so I'm going to choose custom and say month, and then initial display period. Instead of looking at all the data, by default, I want to look at the last year. So again, reload the chart, give it a fresh load, and there we go. I'm looking at the last year from December to December. I can still zoom out, I can still move the chart, but what the chart is doing by default, it's also filtering the data, as you can see. So if I wanted to go back to all data, I can just right here choose all data and look at the total data set. But I'm defining the entry point for the user. So the entry point is the last year or last month or whatever it is available in that data set. So that's one thing. What else? I wanted to play around with the sizes of bins or the values that are being transferred. I first went with a bin size of I think 200 or something. So I created groups, yeah, on 200. So 0 minus 200, 200 based on the total transaction amount. But one of the things that I realized is that, for example, if I go for something like credit, everything's kind of okay because you can see all the values. But if I go for debit, we just have basically a massive disparity, right? We have almost all transactions in the bucket of 0, which is from 0 to 199.99. And the rest of them are very small amounts in comparison to 145K, right? Because, for example, the next follower is just 2.9K, basically 3K. After that, it just keeps going down. So I didn't want to have this one massive column and then just looks like a blank chart. So I created smaller groups. And this is where you can play around with ideas. You can allow the user, for example, to drill down in this massive column and look at smaller segmentations, or you just utilize the smaller segmentation initially and remove the higher segmentation. So now what just basically this allows me to do is to quickly say that, okay, I'm looking at the debit transactions, I'm looking at all data, but I only want to look at transactions which are from 0 to $50. And based on these conditions, the top looks like this, right? You can see that the maximum is 49.99. So different analysis goes for different visuals. In order to create these groups, the easiest method, if you have numbers or even if you have lists, is if you right click on a column, you can right here create new groups. And groups, whenever it comes to a number, you have two types. You can have either bins or lists. Think about it like this. Bin is more automatic, where you define either the number of bins or the size of the bin, whereas list is completely manual. So you specifically define what values are in what groups, right? So what I did is I went with the more automatic approach. I went with bins and just said that, hey, I want you to create bins. I don't know how many are there going to be, but the bin is 50 value. So everything from 0 to 50, for example, everything from minus 49.99 down to 0. So 50 value groups, and just press OK. It's going to create a column, which is going to be called, if you don't change it, amount bins, and then the number of columns you create like this. So it's a very basic approach. If you want to adjust this, you can also right click on it and edit groups. Or alternatively, you can just create a new group and delete this one if you didn't like it. Don't worry about creating new things or playing around with different versions. If you don't make it the first time, that's fine. Trust me, I didn't do it the first time as well. Like I said, I first created too big of a group just to realize that the number disparity is just too high to have it visually appealing. So I'm gonna go with the lower bucket count. So yeah, things like that. What else? Debit and credit. This is the reason why I created this column, because without it, right? What it basically means is I'm looking like this at the values, and I can see that it's minus 500. Everything is always in positive, and it just feels like where are those negative numbers coming from? I do understand why they're there, but how do I find them or focus on them? So I just created a new column that allows me to define whether I'm looking at a debit or a credit. So debit or credit. And what I'm using as a value is actually not the value of amount, but I'm using the count of transactions. And the reason why this is important is because the count of transactions is, for example, always going to be positive. So you could theoretically also use, for example, a donut chart, right? So you can sort of compare the segmentation. How many transactions were for debit? How many transactions do you have in credit? But this is one of the tricky parts because as soon as I choose credit, everything else switches. You're now focusing on negative numbers here, 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 but this one is still going with sort of positive numbers because you're doing it with the count. So just pay attention to this and make sure that the user doesn't get lost in this. Alternatively, if you would be using amount, because that's what I did initially as well, there's one thing that you're going to notice. We don't have credit anymore. Why? Well, because a donut chart cannot simultaneously handle positive and negative values, right? It's not just ZoomCharts donut chart. No, it's the same with the native, for example. You can see it's in the legend. I can also have it in the legend in our visual, but there's not going to be a value for it. Because just think about it realistically, right? If you create a donut chart and you're going in around based on a value, what do you do with the negative? You suddenly start to go backwards? Or how does it work? So if you do want to showcase the value that you have essentially on a donut chart, but for debit and credit to kind of see the split of it, then make sure you, for example, use something like a DAX absolute value, where you're telling it to take this transactional amount and actually just convert it into an absolute value. Sure, it's not going to tell you it's negative, but I can still have that value here. But in that case, what I would say, if this is utilizing this principle, make sure that every single visual utilizes the same approach. So the user doesn't feel like he's splitting from one side to another. Because for example, if I do this, right, everything seems fine. I can select, for example, a bin group and everything. That's the top 10. Now, if I suddenly decide to go for the credit group, top 10 is actually in reverse because top 10 means the least amount. So you would want to turn this around. If you would be using absolute values, that wouldn't be an issue. Because if you use absolute values, you can see the chart again changes up. So it's just a matter of figuring out how you do this. Make sure that the interactions, the cross-chart filters feel intuitive. You're not breaking the experience and the user doesn't get lost. That's the main idea about the visuals. And one thing that I can tell you, trust me, it's one of the things that we do constantly. We love to break your reports. That's a skill that every user has, not the creator, but the user. It doesn't matter how much experience you have, the user is just going to find a way to break the report. So one thing that I can sort of reiterate is make sure you play around with the slicers, the visuals, and everything. So try different cross-filtering directions. And whilst we're on the topic of users, you also now have a QR code on your screens. So I would really appreciate if you could spend like basically like 30 seconds, 40 seconds to leave us a little bit of a feedback, just so we can understand if you like these sessions. If they're good, if they're not, if you're getting any valuable information, or if it just seems like a waste of time, let us know about it. Because the last thing that I want to do as well is host sessions that give nothing to you. It just seems like a waste of time. So if there are any particular topics or any particular sort of approaches you want us to try out, let us know about it and we'll see what we can do about it and we'll try to adapt. Because at the end of the day, this is all for you. Sure, page 1. So transaction amount and the average amounts. based on different transaction types and based on different categories of merchants and a customer profile. And then we had like geographical analysis with this scatter plot. So there's different amounts of different types of visuals that you can essentially utilize here. All right. Questions. What is the difference between the capita income and yearly income? Let's see if our dictionary is more informational than what I already know. Transactions. Was it on card dictionary? User data? Yearly. Well, that really doesn't help me. Um, what I would probably do is I'll be honest, I don't know from the top of my head what would be the difference. I would just try Googling it if you can find any information. If you can, just disregard one and use yearly, for example. At the top of my head, I don't know what's going to be the difference. Sorry. Can I ask about the debt into income ratios because I'm facing a small problem in their values? Sure, you can. What would be the question? Because the ratio is relatively big, yeah, right? For example, in the amounts, only 10% of the trend amount is in the credit, 90% is in the debt. If we go by the amount of transactions in one or the other group, we can see that only 5% are credit transactions, but not some of it. This would be, yeah. Is there any way to prevent the map to automatically zoom out every time I exit the page and return to it? Uh, you can, but you have to figure out what you want to do with the map itself. So the reason why this is always zooming in and out is because it's refreshing and making sure that the user is looking at exactly what's available. Like for example, if I choose, for example, a particular transaction group, you can see it zooms into the place where this transaction is being held, where these transactions are being held. So if I deselect it, it's going to zoom out to make sure that I have all the data in the viewport. Same happens when you move between the pages. Even if I, for example, have selected something here and I zoom in, when I go to a different page and come back, that selection is cleared because this is not a slicer that you save. So it resets and the new filter is being passed to the visual, which is you don't have any data filtered, so it zooms out to the original position. Alternatively, if you have a particular view, one thing that you can do is under base layer, you can say that you don't want to utilize the auto zoom and you actually want to use, for example, a particular saved position. This means that whenever you select this, whatever view you have available, when you click on save, okay, let's save the record. So you're saving this particular view, and that's going to be the fallback. So whenever you move between the pages, it's going to come to this view. On the topic of the map as well, I just noticed. So when I created the map, I had two questions. What are these two, right? So for this one, we can see that we can also add state in the tooltip of the visual. This is how I was looking at it. So added the merchant state. So we can see that there are multiple states, which doesn't really help me. So I would look into these transactions just to see where they're happening, why they're here. What's happening here is quite simple. This is 0, 0. This is for all the points that don't have a geolocation. And this is also something you can take into consideration. If you don't want to showcase them and you don't want these, because this one I think is for Hawaii, Honolulu, yeah. So that's part of US. If you just want to focus on US, you can remove the points that don't have any geographical information. All right, what else? How did you show all data in the earliest date and some of amount chart? Um, so the earliest date is just taking the name from this field. So by default, it's taking the earliest date. There we go. So by default, it's taking the earliest date, but you can also change the name of it to anything else. So I'm gonna, for example, go for all data. The display unit is gonna be quarters. And I'm just gonna replace the earliest date So that's the name of the column. So if I switch between them, everything reloads, gonna be in quarters. There we go. But you can see it's no longer earliest date. It's just a regular date. Okay, I'm getting from the team. Yeah, I'm getting a message that we don't have any other questions. Well, I guess that's gonna be it then. Look at that, 3 extra minutes. Hey, I'm efficient. No, but in reality, just like I said, guys, don't be afraid to just try things out. Even if your report isn't perfect, if you think certain things might be adjusted, or if you just want us to take a look at the report and give you feedback, create that report and submit it. Because once you submit it, we are going to be able to take a look at it and comment. If you don't submit it and wait till the very last day, remember that we're also just humans, right? So if there is a massive surge of submissions in the very last day, it's just not humanly possible to respond to every single one of you in time. So the sooner you submit one of the versions, the easier it is for us to go through it, give you feedback, and gives you enough time to actually do the modifications. If you keep everything for the last time, it's kind of hard to go through it. Please show how to create bins. Sure. So for example, bins based on amount, you find in the dataset transaction data, amount, right click on it, new group, choose the group type bin, and choose the bin type, whether it's the size of the bin or the number of the bins. So I could also say that, hey, I want to only have 4 different groups. And it's going to say that the average bin size, not 108, 4. The one bin is going to be $602. So if I create something like this, I can just always take a look at it. And this is why it's just efficient to sometimes play around with it. So we can see that most of the transactions fall into group -500 to 0. Is it in 0 or is it up to 50? Okay, or 102. There we go. So these are the boundaries. So yeah, play around with those. Okay, well, thank you so much for attending. I hope the session itself was interesting and informative and you actually managed to learn something new. If you did, make sure you also leave us a little bit of a feedback. Remember, there was that QR code. Yeah, if the team could also put on yeah, there we go. So the new QR code you see there is for the feedback form. So if you leave us your feedback and tell us if you learned or not, it's just going to help us to understand what we can do to make these sessions better. At the end of the day, like I said, these sessions are for you. So anything we can do to make them better, more, let's say, beneficial, we're always looking forward to it. All right. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you in the top 5 announcement. Bye, everyone.